Welcome to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician, where Dr. Disha Spath will be your companion on this exciting financial adventure. Get ready to conquer debt, build wealth, and embrace a mindful spending lifestyle that will empower you to live life on your own terms.
Welcome to Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician, the show where we explore the intersection of finance, happiness, and purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Disha Spath, and today we're diving into the Purpose Code, how to unlock meaning, maximize happiness, and leave a lasting legacy by Dr. Jordan Grumet. Dr. Grumet is a distinguished physician and a trailblazer in the field of financial independence and well-being. Born in Evanston, Illinois in 1973, he pursued his education at the University of Michigan before earning his medical degree from Northwestern University. Currently, he serves as the Associate Medical Director at Journey Care Hospice in Northbrook, Illinois, where he applies his extensive medical expertise. In addition to his medical career, Dr. Grumet is the creator of the award-winning Earn and Invest podcast, where he offers valuable insights into financial independence. His work has garnered significant recognition, winning the Plutus Award for the Best New Personal Finance Podcast in 2019 and being a finalist for the Best Personal Finance Podcast in 2020. In today's fast-paced world, many of us are searching for ways to live more purposefully while securing financial freedom. Dr. Jordan Grumet's newest book offers an inspiring and practical guide to finding your personal sense of purpose. I'm thrilled to discuss how finding purpose relates to our financial journey. So let's jump right in. Hey, Jordan, how are you?
It is so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I love talking to you. You're so inspiring. And thank you so much for sharing your book with us. It's not out yet. It's going to be coming out in January. We're recording this a little bit in advance, so in case anything is out of date by then, I'll try to update it as much as possible. But for right now, I'm super glad to have your time today to tell us about this book and why we should read it. You start the book with a profound statement about how most of us struggle with the anxiety of finding purpose. What are your thoughts on why so many people feel overwhelmed when trying to discover their big purpose in life?
So I actually discovered this after writing my first book, Taking Stock. And one of the main ideas behind Taking Stock is I always said we have to put our purpose, identity, connections before our financial framework and then build the financial framework around it. And as I was promoting this book and giving talks and going to conferences, I would get people who'd come to me at the end of my talk and they'd be angry. And they'd be kind of sweating and a little bit pissed off. And they'd look at me and they'd say, you keep on telling me to find my purpose. I don't know what my purpose is. I've been searching for it forever. And I don't think it exists. So the first time I heard this, I said, oh, well, you get a little bit of everything at a conference. But when I started hearing it over and over again, I realized that there was a problem here. Purpose was not nourishing the way I thought it was to many people. So I did a dive down the rabbit hole. I looked at a bunch of studies about purpose and I found two things that contradict each other. One is that purpose is associated with health, longevity, and happiness. There are tons and tons of studies. It's been well proven. On the other hand, I found other studies that show that people get what's called purpose anxiety, fear, anxiety, depression around this topic of purpose. Up to 91% of people get that at some point in their lives. So how do you explain this paradox? What I realized through all my experience as a hospice doctor, as a writer, as a podcaster, a masterminder, and as a coach, is that we probably get purpose wrong. And there's probably not one version of purpose, but two, and one of them leads more to disappointment, and the other leads more to this health, happiness, and longevity. And that's why I wrote this book, The Purpose Code, to describe the difference between the two and how maybe we can go after the more healthy version.
Well, I definitely resonate with what you said about purpose anxiety, because I have to say, I started reading your book while I was on my medical leave after having a surgery, and feeling that purposelessness of sitting on a couch for 2 weeks and not being useful to society was incredibly distressing to me. And actually, it's funny, your book starts out with a story about Julia Child finding her purpose when she has her first meal in France. And I hadn't started your book yet, but I actually bought Julia Child's cookbook recently. And during my leave, I decided to tackle it. And that was kind of a bad idea, making souffle after having abdominal surgery.
Not so easy. Yeah.
Not so easy. She's like, you keep whisking here. And while you're doing that, they need to put the, whatever. Anyway, I hurt myself a little, but her purpose helped me just get out of the funk of feeling purposeless and feeling that anxiety of like, what is it that I really want to do with my life? Because I'm sort of in a turning point myself. And I find that you hit the nail on the head with the anxiety portion of it. Now, you mentioned the two different types of purposes. Tell me about that and how we differentiate the two.
So let's first talk about this idea of feeling purposeless. We've been sold by society this idea that purpose is supposed to be something big, life-changing, last our whole lives.
Right.
And make a huge difference. And if you think about it, we see it everywhere. Like if you're on Instagram or TikTok, you'll see people who create this version of purpose, which is the 8-figure business, right? Or being healthy, that you have 8-pack abs up into your 70s, or it's traveling the world. And it's these really, really big ideas. And that's mirrored by marketing, right? Because we have marketing out there trying to sell us products, and they're trying to convince us of what purpose should look like in our life or who we should be. And the problem is all these forces are trying to sell us something, right? Influencers are trying to sell us something. Marketing is trying to sell us something. So it's very clear that we have been sold this basket of products of what purpose should be, and they're usually very big and difficult to accomplish. And that gives us anxiety when we look at our own lives and compare it to these images, these videos that we're seeing online, and it doesn't look the same. That is actually what I call big P purpose. This is very big, audacious purpose. It's usually goal-oriented, and it's usually all or nothing. Like you either get there or you don't. You either get the 6-pack abs or you don't. You either become president or a billionaire or build a big business or you don't. And as opposed to being abundance mindset oriented, which people think it is, it's actually very scarcity mindset oriented. You have to be the right person at the right time, saying the right things, have the right genetics, and also happen to have a lot of luck. Otherwise, you're not going to be the president. You're not going to cure cancer. You're not going to be on that first flight to Mars. All those things take incredible number of things to be in alignment, including luck. So you don't have much agency. And so it's often all or nothing, and it's easy to fail these things. And that leads to disappointment. It's loss of agency, right? We don't have as much control as we would like. That's big P purpose. And I think that's the kind that doesn't make us happy. Contrast that to what I call little P purpose. Instead of being goal oriented, it's very much process oriented. So it's all about enjoying the actual doing of the things, and the goals don't matter as much. So as opposed to being scarcity mindset oriented, this is very abundant, because think about it. Any one of us could think of a million things that we just enjoy the process of doing. The other thing is it's almost impossible to fail these things, right? So it's not all or nothing, it's all or all. And so what I think we need to do is start focusing on these things that we have some agency over, and that we start building a life of purpose around these things. And you'll notice I said build, I didn't say find, because a lot of people are really stuck on this idea that there's this one thing they have to find, and if they don't find it, all is lost. Like if they find it, life is perfect, and if they don't find it, all is lost. We have some anchors to the things that are purposeful to us, but actually you have to build a life of purpose. It's a very active process.
I find it so interesting that you introduced this concept. Being a big player in the financial independence community as far as the influence, and you give so many talks, and in financial independence, the mindset for FIRE is work as hard as possible, get to an X number of money, and then essentially be purposeless.
I think that was the argument. And what happened is we had the first generation of people going through this process, getting to FIRE, celebrating it, and then falling into depression and anxiety. And so this is a very common trope in the FIRE community, especially those people who started kind of in the early 2000s or 2010, 2012. Some of those first generation FIRE practitioners, at least from our century, found themselves very unhappy. And then what they had to do is they had to build a life of purpose eventually, or they ended up falling out and going back to work. Now, the newer generation of FIRE practitioners is much smarter. So they're focusing on things like slow FIRE, coast FIRE. We can go into what those are, but basically they're ways that we can start looking at financial independence in a way that we don't have to rush so much, that we can start being smart with our finances, but do exactly what I talk about in my first book, Taking Stock, which is build a financial framework around our sense of purpose. And so we can start living for today and not have to wait till tomorrow. Because if money is your goal and fire is your answer, you're going to reach that goal and you're going to feel a certain amount of emptiness, because money is a great tool to live the lives we want, but it's not a very good goal. And so even if you accumulate all that money, you still have to figure out how you're going to fill the rest of your time. And winning the game, in my opinion, is filling that time with as much stuff you love and as little things that you loathe. So money is a great tool to do that, but it's only one of many tools that we have. I mean, we have our youth, our energy, our communities, our passions. We have all these other tools, and we want to win the game, which means starting today, not sometime in the future. We want to look at our calendars and fill them up with as many things we love and as few things we loathe. And that's the way to do that, is we have to become very clear on what purpose looks like in our life. It's not that we want to ignore our finances, but our finances want to be our partner in doing those things.
That's interesting. Finding that purpose, little p purpose even, can be challenging. So you're saying sit down, write it out? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there are a number of ways to explore your purpose anchors, because remember, we got to build a life of purpose. We don't find it, but you do want to start searching out these purpose anchors. And believe it or not, I truly believe most people actually know what's really important to them. They're just scared to voice it. We know what we dream about and fantasize about right before we fall asleep. We know those themes throughout childhood and young adulthood that were important to us. But a lot of times we, again, abandon those when society and TikTok and Instagram and marketers tell us what we should be focusing on. But if we're willing to do some of the work, a lot of times we can find those anchors. And in the book, I talk about 4 or 5 specific ways to do that. But we can do these exercises, start getting in touch with what these anchors are. And then once you know what some of these anchors are, it's the process of building around them. I call the process the climb. That's building a life of purpose around an anchor. And that's what we should really be spending most of our lives doing, is building these climbs, these purposeful activities that are good activities to fill our time as time passes, because we have very little control over that.
In this podcast, we often talk about balancing, building a life that's ideal to us and managing finance. How does your purpose work then translate into how we are managing our finances?
Well, I think we should really look at it as our finances are a tool that helps us live the life we want to live. And so what's really important is purpose comes first. You've got to do some of this purpose work. Once you've done that, we can very clear-eyed look at our finances and decide how to build that financial framework around it. And so let me give you some examples. Let's say you're a doctor like me and you decide, I don't like doctoring. I don't like doctoring. It's not a good use of my time. In fact, I'm finding myself loathing a lot of the time I spend being a doctor, but I'm making a lot of money. And so you could make the decision, what I really want to be is a writer or a podcaster. I'm using my own experience here, right? You can make a bunch of big decisions right there and then. You can decide, A, it's worth it to me to work 5 more years really hard, make a lot of money, put writing and podcasting and all that aside so that I can accumulate enough wealth so I can leave that job and spend the rest of my life doing that. That is one great pathway, but it's just one pathway. You could also say, I don't want to wait 5 years. I might die young. Things might change. The world might pass me by. So I'm going to go part-time. And because I go part-time, I'm not going to be able to retire in 5 years. I might have to do this thing that I don't love for 10 years or even 15 years. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to get half my week back and I can start pursuing things like podcasting and writing or public speaking now. That's also a great option. Or maybe you're lucky enough and you don't have any medical school debt and you can say, I'm going to leave my job. I'm single. I don't have that many responsibilities and I'm going to become a podcaster and I'm actually going to build a business around it, or I'm going to become an author, or I'm going to become a radio jockey, who knows, a talk show host. All of those things you could also do depending on what your responsibilities are and what other tools you have. So all 3 of those options are good for different people, but it's having this sense of purpose first and then deciding which path works best for you. And so that's how they intermix. We can't really make good financial decisions unless we know a little bit of our why behind them. because money is just a tool that helps us live that good life. So if you're blindly making money, but you don't know what you're using that tool to achieve, you're kind of lost.
You're famous in the finance world for making $1 million a year as a primary care internist. You were doing fantastically, going really hard, working all the time. Then you changed. You went over to hospice doing finance creator stuff. Tell us about that journey and what decisions led you to where you are currently.
Well, first and foremost, when I was 7 years old, my father died. And that kind of put me in the track of becoming a doctor because he was a doctor. I wanted to be just like him. I thought I could kind of fix the cosmic wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that becoming a doctor wasn't joyful or purposeful for me. It actually was for many, many years. Like I created an identity around this and built a sense of purpose around it. And as a kid, it was the only thing I thought about. And it was actually very joyful. It wasn't painful. I enjoyed the classes. I enjoyed working towards it. But there became a point when I was practicing that it was no longer as joyful. I found I was spending a lot of time doing things I didn't like doing, like paperwork, and I didn't feel like I was helping my patients nearly as much as I thought I would.
Mhm.
Now, being a happy person who's always built their life around purpose and identity and joy, I thought, okay, well, being a doctor isn't fixing things, and I need to make enough money to eventually be able to not be a doctor. Why don't I gamify this a little bit and build this big business and build this practice and really maximize my income? So I tried to funnel some of that joy into the process of building a business and becoming an independent entrepreneur. And I did these things and I did make a lot of money, and it allowed me to save and invest a lot. But I also still realized that that wasn't really answering the problem or scratching the itch that I really had, because deep down inside, being a physician probably wasn't truly my current sense of purpose. And even being an entrepreneur, whereas joyful in the beginning, didn't feel like it was my calling either. And I knew I had these other anchors I wanted to explore. I knew I wanted to write more. At the time, it was blogging. Eventually, it came to podcasting. I knew I wanted to do more public speaking. And so it became very clear to me that I, at some point, had enough money. What I was doing wasn't serving me anymore. And so I started looking at that calculus of my schedule, like time I love versus time I loathe. And I was still doing way more that I loathed, or at least felt medium about, and not nearly enough stuff was on the calendar that I loved. And so I made the very purposeful decision to step away from the high salary. I think I went from making almost $1 million a year to making maybe $250,000 the next year. Very quickly dropped down. And from there, it went to 200 and then 150 and then 100. I mean, it kept falling year after year. But I realized I had enough money, and that money was no longer feeling purposeful or joyful. It was just a tool. And now that I had enough of this tool, I didn't have to keep working to make more of it. I could start using that tool to free up my time, right? I didn't have to work to make a living anymore. So I could use that tool to free up my time to start doing more purposeful activities, which became writing and podcasting and public speaking and all these things that I always knew, even as a kid, that I loved doing, but I never gave myself permission to actually spend the majority of my time doing those things.
That's really inspiring. And, I think you're doing great work as a finance public speaker because you share these ideas. One of the most impactful chapters in your book is about regret and how embracing purpose can erase it. You share stories from hospice patients about their biggest regrets, which often aren't financial, but about how they spent their time. Do you think this perspective can change the way we approach our financial goals? And has it changed yours?
Oh, for sure. I mean, no one on their deathbed says, I wish I worked more nights and weekends. No one on their deathbed says, man, I only made it to a net worth of 1 million. I really wish I made it up to 2 million. People basically say, I regret that I never had the energy, courage, or time to, and then it's fill in the blank, because we're all different and we have all different things that are important to us. And so we were talking earlier about purpose anchors, right? You don't find purpose, but you have to identify these purpose anchors to build a life of purpose around. Well, a great way to start thinking about what some of your purpose anchors could be is to put yourselves in the shoes of that dying person and ask yourself the same question. If I found out I was going to die next week, what would I regret that I never had the energy, courage, or time to accomplish? And so regret in a dying person is very disappointing because you don't have agency to fix anything. But
Right.
regret in a young, healthy person who has time in front of them is just another name for purpose. And so
Mm.
this is one of those great places to start thinking about your purpose anchors. For instance, I knew when I asked myself that question years ago, I knew if I didn't traditionally publish a book, I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. And I could see myself in the shoes of my hospice patients being on my deathbed saying, I wish I had the courage to do this. And so I knew I had to go do that. And that's part of the reason I published my first book, Taking Stock. This is a great place to start. It's one of many techniques. Like I said, there are multiple techniques to find your purpose anchor, but asking yourself that question about regrets and doing what I call a hospice life review, great way to start identifying what's really important to you so you can then build that life of purpose around it.
That sounds like a good way to definitely zone in on the things that you really need to be focusing on in the future. In your book, you talk about leaving a lasting legacy, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of the impact we have on others. In your opinion, how can we align our financial strategies with the idea and our life strategies with the idea of leaving a meaningful legacy?
Yeah. And I want to remind people again, the financial strategies are just one of many tools you have. It really is more the life strategies, but we want to keep in mind that our finances allow us to free up our time so that we can start filling it with things that are important to us. When I talk about impact and legacy, it's probably one of the biggest questions I get, because when I talk about this framework of purpose and I talk about big P purpose, which are those big audacious goals, and little P purpose, and I suggest that we should abandon big P purpose and work on little P purpose, the biggest question I get is, yeah, but what about impact and legacy? See, if I go for these big things, I can change the world. And if I just go for these little things, I'm not going to make a difference. And when people kind of tell me that, I usually tell them the story of my maternal grandfather, because he is a perfect example to me of what little P purpose can actually do in the world. So my maternal grandfather died years before I was born. He died in the 1960s. I was born in 1973. And he loved math. Math was his little P purpose. And because he loved it, because he just had a joy of it, he became an accountant. He was a CPA. And when my mom was little, back in the 1950s, she would sit on his lap and he would show her his big spreadsheets, because in the 1950s, they didn't have computers and these kind of things. You had to write all your numbers out in a big spreadsheet. And he would explain to her what all the different areas meant in the spreadsheet and what numbers he was putting in and why. My mom saw him at his most joyful doing this. And so she, as most kids did, tried on that identity. My father loves this thing he does. Maybe I'll love it too. She tried on that identity and she ended up loving math too. In fact, she became a CPA also. Now, when I was a little kid, I had a learning disability and I couldn't read. Like all my peers were on their beginning readers and I was stuck coloring in a coloring book because I couldn't progress. And that would have been a really, really bad time for me, except for one thing. You see, I had adapted to my mom's love of math and I loved math too. So while I was horrible at reading and couldn't even start the beginning readers, I was at the top of the grade for my math skills. On some level, I knew I must be okay. And it was one of the things that really carried me through going to all these tutors and getting over my learning disability, et cetera. I eventually went into a highly mathematical field. I became a doctor. And I remember once at the beginning of my career, I was in the hospital seeing a patient who kept on getting it admitted for dehydration. I looked at his electrolytes. I'm like, that's funny. Those are abnormal. And I thought back to a mathematical concept that related to a disease that we don't often see. Not a horribly rare disease, but one that we don't see all the time. And that helped me make the diagnosis. Seeing this mathematical relationship, we made the diagnosis. It was one of those few things that actually was fairly treatable. The guy stopped getting dehydrated and stopped being admitted to the hospital. Well, this guy happened to be a pastor at a local church. And one of the things he did is he took in runaway kids and helped them get social services and feed them. And if they're old enough, get jobs. And so I start thinking about this. The joy, the little P purpose of my grandfather 60 some years ago, hundreds of miles away, is directly proportional to this child in modern day Illinois getting help when they needed it most. Like my maternal grandfather's actions still have meaning. Like a stone dropped in the ocean, it displaced a little bit of water. And over the years, it's joined with other waves to get bigger at times and then dissipated to become the smallest of small waves. But now 60 years later, that wave is coming up onto the sand, onto the beach, and still having an impact. That's legacy. Let me contrast that to a childhood love of mine. I loved collecting baseball cards when I was a little kid. And one of the baseball cards that I always wanted to have was a Mickey Mantle baseball card. Mickey Mantle was arguably one of the best baseball players ever. You know, he hit the most home runs a number of years in a row. He was revered. He was in the Hall of Fame, etc. Mickey Mantle never changed my life. My maternal grandfather did, but Mickey Mantle, besides liking his baseball cards, didn't do anything for me. In fact, if I had decided that I wanted to be just like Mickey Mantle as a kid, if I had that big, audacious purpose, most likely I would have failed. I would have never been a Major League Baseball player. I didn't have the genetics. I wasn't fast enough, strong enough. I didn't have the skill. I didn't have the energy or time to spend all the time learning to be a baseball player, et cetera. So if I had focused on patterning my life off of Mickey Mantle, this big P purpose, I would have had a lot of purpose anxiety when I realized I wasn't fast enough, strong enough, or lucky enough to know the right people to end up in the major leagues. And so that's the difference. Big P purpose actually often leads to not bigger impact like everyone thinks, but often anxiety and a feeling of failure. Whereas little P purpose, when you do things that light you up, you attract other people to you and you change their lives.
And I've seen that play out in my own life too. So you're telling people, don't dream big, dream small. And those small dreams will eventually lead to something bigger, but that's not important, really. What's more important is that you're loving the process, that you love what you're doing.
I like to say I'm goal agnostic, but not goal phobic. You can dream big, but if the full joy and happiness of whatever you're doing is based on either reaching or not reaching the goal, then you probably have it wrong. But if the joy is in the doing, and if you reach the goal, great. And if you don't reach the goal, it was still a good use of your time, then I think you have it right.
Dr. Grumet, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to leave with our audience today?
I think it still comes back to simple and straightforward. Purpose becomes before money, and purpose is abundant. And so enjoy the abundance, embrace it. It's not supposed to be anxiety provoking. It's supposed to be low stakes. And I think if you can look at it that way, you'll find that happiness is a lot easier.
Thank you for joining us today as we explored the Purpose Code by Dr. Jordan Grumet. Remember, purpose isn't just about big achievements, but also about the small, meaningful actions we take every day. Financial freedom is just one piece of the puzzle. What truly matters is how we use our time and resources to create a life of meaning and happiness. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, stay purposeful and financially free.
The content shared on this podcast should not be taken as individualized financial advice. We are here to share our knowledge and experiences, but it is crucial to consult with professionals such as accountants, financial advisors, or attorneys who can provide personalized guidance based on your specific needs.